Hello and welcome to Workforce Wisdom. I'm your host, Christy Bray, Chief Customer Officer at PracticeLink. This podcast explores the latest trends in healthcare recruitment, highlighting innovative strategies, success stories, and fresh perspectives that are transforming the healthcare workforce. These episodes will lead to in-depth, thoughtful discussions with recognized industry-leading healthcare professionals, exploring the challenges of healthcare recruitment and beyond. Whether you're an experienced recruitment professional or just starting, this podcast aims to help you discover how experts are reshaping the industry, leveraging technology, and fostering inclusive hiring practices. Today's episode, AI, Misconduct, and Modern Healthcare Hiring, Preventing Risk Before It Walks Through the Door. I'm excited to have Ben Mones, the CEO and founder of Fama, an award-winning AI-based software company trusted by thousands of talent acquisition teams from around the globe. He regularly appears in major media outlets and on podcasts, and is an expert on how technology is shaping society, particularly in the workplace. In addition to leading Fama, Ben serves on the boards of a handful of high-growth startups and mentors entrepreneurs. Outside of work, you can find Ben on the basketball court or huddled over his smoker, cooking up barbecue for his family of four. He's based in Los Angeles, California. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you, Christy. Excited to be here on Workforce Wisdom.
Awesome. So, Ben, you've built Fama into a leading AI platform focused on workplace misconduct detection. So we've talked about background checks before and some of these things that I think every responsible organization does now. But, what problem did you see in the market that those traditional background checks weren't solving?
For sure. And thanks again for having me on board. And looking forward to chatting today. So when we started the company, we saw a really unique opportunity where, businesses for a long period of time have been evaluating, I'll just say, behavior as part of their talent screening process, right? The kind of questions they ask around capabilities, leadership assessments, or sort of scenario modeling, if you will, putting you in the seat, that you're going to be in. For a long time, employers have said, we want to get a sense of how this person's going to help advance our mission, shepherd our organization into its next chapter, address patient needs, bring that kind of, community trust, that patient trust into not just the operating room, but, front office, et cetera, right? And so one of the things that we saw was that for today's workforce, which is, now 50% Gen Z and millennial, where I know we'll talk about today at a point where there are 6 different generations in the workforce, but the majority of those generations are either digital natives, or I like to say kind of digital immigrants, folks that have adopted, that digital ecosystem, right? Social media, who we are online, et cetera. Look no further than, probably people around you with their faces buried in their phones, posting anything and everything on social media, right? And so for this generation, what we've seen, and it sort of tracks to how people evaluate talent today, is that a lot of those signals around behavior that employers had sought to identify, particularly when it comes to de-risking, right? Is this person going to treat people fairly based on what they look like? Are they going to treat people of different religions the same way? Are they going to respect, in our world of healthcare, HIPAA rules and regs, the very specific types of privacy violations? I would all just say more generally, patient trust. A lot of those signals can appear online. And so what we do as a company is we help, businesses sort of extract and identify those same sorts of behaviors they've always cared about, but do it via the online record where most of their workforce is today. So some people call it like a social media background check, but at the end of the day, what we do is really helping make sure that employers can get dialed in on the behaviors that matter based on, where these sorts of risks appear for today's workforce. And that's online.
Yeah. We talk a lot about how technology is shaping workplace culture in healthcare specifically. Why is that misconduct prevention a patient safety issue rather than just an HR issue?
Yeah, I think part of it is in the office, in the hospital, in the operating room, in the aftercare facility, whatever it might be. Those are very vulnerable moments where a lot of trust, I've said the word patient trust a few times. I think you can expand that concept, patient trust, into this broader theme of what I'll call community trust, right? Where when somebody comes in and they have to be, in the hospital, or they have to be, kind of in that moment when they're on their back foot, so to speak, the last thing I think that many care providers want is to cause or sow any doubt for that patient, right? Or put that patient in a position where they might not feel comfortable sharing what's actually going on or the root of the issue that they're experiencing, right? So when it comes to patient safety, I view that question more as making sure that the type of care, palliative or otherwise, that that person is receiving is actually reflective of what that person is experiencing. And part of that is an open and candid communication between, that patient and the care provider, right? So a lot of times what we see are, if you think that the nurse that's attending to you is going to be taking photos of you and posting videos of you when you've been, put under because of some operation you're about to go in, you're probably not going to go to that hospital. You're not going to get that procedure, right? That sounds crazy, like somebody would do that, but there was just an article this past week. It's, February here that we're talking 2026. And just this past week, there was a hospital in, the Southeast where a nurse was fired for doing that very thing, right? So you can imagine not just patient safety, but patient trust and ensuring they get the care that they actually need. So that's really where we see this is not just like an HR issue. This is like the core of what we're doing, right? Making sure that the baseline expectations that we agreed to are being adhered to by, the folks that are tending to, not just our customers, but the people who are coming in and seeking care.
Yeah. Fama has produced several pieces of content that we'll link at the end and the PracticeLink website. But in the article titled "What is Healthcare Misconduct?" you outline really how that misconduct extends far beyond criminal history. And that example you gave is a good example. But what are the most common types of red flag behaviors that healthcare organizations really should be paying attention to?
I think there's the kind of what I'll describe as, baseline sorts of behaviors from a general misconduct perspective. And I'll kind of zoom in on some of the more healthcare specific risk that we identify. But the very first thing we see, are care providers and hospital systems. We're lucky to work with some of the largest healthcare systems in the world that screen everybody from, residents to nurses to doctors to really anybody that's going to be patient facing, and even some folks that are in the administrative and leadership, side of the house. But really the idea that we see as a starting point is, is this person going to give equivalent care and deliver services in a way that is consistent regardless of the person that they're serving, right? So one of the things that we flag for in our product are things like intolerance or harassment, for example, right? If you see people that are saying, there was a great example a few years ago, this was, almost 10 years ago now at this point, at the Cleveland Clinic, where there was a nurse who had posted on Twitter that she was going to give Jews the wrong medicine, and all these other anti-Semitic comments, right? You could imagine that sort of type of misconduct that would be relevant in any industry, but specifically in healthcare, when you talk about a person's life being on the line, the care that they're receiving, the medicine they're receiving, that's one of the very specific types of misconduct that we see. But I would say that's kind of broad-based. All of our clients, financial services, healthcare, technology, transportation, screen for that sort of stuff. But in healthcare, we often see clients that are very specific in terms of screening for illegal drug use, particularly as it relates to the abuse of prescription medicine. We've seen examples of, employees of hospital healthcare systems who, post about, codeine or medicine that they've, taken from other, sort of Schedule I drugs that they've taken from their hospital and literally advertising for sale on social media, which again, can't believe that happens, but it does. And then I'd say the more, consistent things that happen across the board are, HIPAA violations, right? Of people sharing things about patients, talking about the names of patients, procedures, et cetera. And I think many healthcare providers know and attest to the fact that they shouldn't be doing that. But, even little things like saying, I operated on this person at this hospital at this time, even not naming that person's name can be a HIPAA violation if someone can kind of, deconstruct and figure out, reverse engineer what the hospital was, what sort of patients were there, at that time, who the doctor was, and the type of procedures they, tend to perform. So we've seen a range of issues, but I'd say it kind of ranges from the basic of making sure people are going to treat people equivalently and fairly based on how they present, what they look like, where they come from. But on the other end of the spectrum, more very specific healthcare system risks that relate to HIPAA and privacy violations of, again, people who are on the provider side saying and doing things or posting content that they shouldn't be, even if the patient is not in the room, right? Where we saw a horrible example of that of a few nurses posting something a few months ago about a patient who had left a stain on a chair or something like that, or people might remember that one.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting. I was trying to think back. I've been in healthcare long enough to remember pre-HIPAA, but it has been around so long that it's crazy to think people still don't get it in terms of, that the privacy that is inherently protected within that act. That's just it kind of blows my mind. But maybe it's because I was there before and now, and maybe it's just something that I wouldn't say it's mainstream. I hope not, right? But people just don't have that filter, I guess.
Yeah, and social media has done that, I think, in a lot of ways where, you know, so many, speaking more broadly about social media, so many more things are now done in public that might have been done in private, right? Where I am sure those things might have happened in a break room or, in a breakfast the next morning or something like that before a shift starts, right? But now with TikTok and easy, you can just pull out your phone, post a video, post a comment, post a picture, that same sort. And it's not saying people can't, talk about their work amongst providers. I'm sure that happens, right? I mean, that's part of the profession. But, at the end of the day, when you expose that to the public and you put a patient or someone in a position and expose information that you really shouldn't, it changes the dynamic. So I think you see kind of, to your point, maybe old behaviors that now manifest differently via the online record where, yeah, maybe stuff that happened over breakfast, having a coffee and saying, oh my gosh, this patient yesterday, could you believe this case that I had? Now that might be happening on social media.
Yeah. Do you think it's a function of the like follow culture or that kind of that dynamic where people want to kind of boost themselves up? And so do you think has anything to do with it?
I it depends on your view of the world and humanity, but I would say, yeah, from my personal perspective, look, I've been running, Fama for 11 years now. I am deep in the world of social media. I've watched, new platforms emerge, video explode. Like we were talking before we started the podcast, YouTube kind of first come out and then drift down a little bit, and now is the largest social media platform in the world. There is this like and follow culture where now things that should always have remained private and should remain private. Not everything needs to be posted, but I do think, and I really don't blame people for this either. Like many know, there are, engineers getting paid hundreds of thousands of dollars a year trying to figure out how to get you to be part of that like and follow culture, right? Literally sitting in front of a whiteboard saying like, oh, well, Ben and Christy, they just could have clicked this button and then they would stay for longer. So, we are all part of that system, like it or not, business and personal wise. And I do think that like and follow culture has played a role, and it's hard to see how reversible that is. You see some of this like social media for teens being banned in certain countries now. We're at the beginning of that journey and, probably outside the scope of today's podcast, but maybe that could be our follow-up. Maybe we could do that as a follow-up.
Yeah. Yeah. It would be great, like as a mom of teens to have that as a follow-up podcast. I think I have listeners who that would resonate with. I know we talked about it the other day. Your children are younger, but it is very, very scary to have these kids who their whole lives have had a digital footprint, and what is that going to look like in the future?
Well, to bring that back too, and sure, totally, I would love to do that. But now just remember, I myself, I'm like a late stage millennial, right? I got social media in 2005 when I was, just getting into university, right? And those people, people who are my age who are just, I hate to say it, 40 years old. And I'm just say that really quiet. Hopefully the microphone didn't pick up exactly how old I just said I was. But, we've had digital identity since we were young, right? And so that concept, that question of like, where is that line between social media and, the analog and offline world? I think for many of us in the millennial generation specifically, and I'd imagine Gen Z as well, we don't see a huge difference, right? Like there isn't like that continuity break between, as we were saying before, what happens over breakfast happens on TikTok, right? Like those two things are by and large the same. I think for millennials, maybe who lived a life slightly separately a bit, before back in the Snake and T9 days of those, Nokia phones we used to have, like those days are long gone now. But you have to recognize that the people who are employed in hospital and healthcare systems around the globe and care providers more generally, they're digital natives. They've got a digital presence that's as deep or more complex and deeper than who they are in the analog world, which is a crazy thing to say, but it's true.
Yeah, for sure. We talked a little bit about the kind of that power dynamic that exists in healthcare. And I do think it's unique because physicians, have always had this like authority place in our lives and in society. But Then couple that with, like you said, that patient vulnerability. Maybe you get that team hierarchy dynamic from, nurse and support staff and stuff. How does that amplify really this impact of that toxic or inappropriate behavior compared to other industries where, it just doesn't seem the same?
Yeah. Wow. What a fantastic question. I think, it's one of these things where in certainly any sort of organization where power dynamics like that are at play, the actions of the individuals in power, regardless of the intent, regardless of the reasons why that behavior was communicated, right? It comes with a sense of authority, right? If you have a care provider or a physician, to use your example, who is guiding you down a path and there is that vulnerability, there is that trust, in organizations, right, we see a lot of times, I'll skip even the healthcare answer, but in normal companies, bosses that say and do things project power in their words and how they say them. People, we all know this. You follow your boss's lead, even if you don't really agree with it, right? Somebody asks you how your day was, who's your boss, that's different than somebody who's asking you. It's like, oh, why does Ben care about how my day was? It's like, oh, he's really handsome. But in the world of healthcare, it's a very different story where, to your point, you have this power dynamic that's projected downward where the violation of that, I'm not going to use the term sacrosanct, but this sort of like unspoken trust that we have with care providers. And I'm not a care provider myself, and I'm a tech guy, all that. But like I've worked with enough hospital and healthcare systems just to see when that's broken, it's really hard to get back. Really hard to get back. And it's easy to believe too, when you see the other side of the coin, that everyone else is like that, right? You don't trust the healthcare system. You don't trust the hospital system, right? We've seen a lot of people who do their own research, right? And maybe propose types of medical treatment or care that, is outside of what a physician would recommend to someone. And we see that across the board, but it all starts to me with trust at the end of the day. And I think patient trust is one term, but I really would extrapolate this is about community trust. This is about, does the community trust the care provider? And any chinks in the armor are really hard to, unwind or bring back to the way that they were.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the trust factor is so big because we know that people defer care because of that trust factor, and so then they're hitting the ED and they're in far worse shape than had they, gone to see someone at an earlier stage. So all of that equates ultimately back to finances and then what it takes to support that patient who's now, potentially in crisis when, had the trust been there and they were seen sooner, different outcome.
Oh, it's a vicious cycle. I couldn't agree more. Where that trust, is diminished, and then the elective procedures. Where again, I'm not a hospital executive, but I do know that elective procedures tend to be the higher profit, where hospital and healthcare systems tend to make their money. And when you start to lose that trust, and all it takes is a news article or a post or a tweet or a HIPAA violation, that people in the community are like, what, like maybe I can put off that so-and-so surgery, or maybe I can, to your point, defer that care that my physician recommended I get because it's just not there. And trust is a hard thing to win back, no matter what scenario you're in, healthcare or in a relationship, whatever it might be. Those are hard things to rebuild.
Hello, I'm Georgia Scott from PracticeLink, and I'm excited to introduce an upcoming podcast from the PracticeLink Media Network, MD Bookshelf. My new weekly show will invite physicians and healthcare professionals to share the books that help them push through burnout, find clarity, or see their careers in a new way. Honest conversations, unexpected reads, and a little inspiration along the way. MD Bookshelf, launching soon.
So part of the recruitment cycle, which is, my background where I've grown up, really is, you go through a credentialing verifications process, so many organizations, most, I think all, have some type of medical staff office or a CVO that's doing this work. But, as I think also those organizations assume that that type of credentialing process really protects them. What are some of the blind spots really between like those licensure checks, and these are primary source verification, and then you maybe get some reference checks from the HR team? What are the blind spots between that and then really that behavioral risk we've been talking about?
Yeah, I think it's a very astute observation, and I'm loving this podcast so far. By the way, so this has been so fun talking with you. But I call it the false security blanket, right? You have this like sense of quality of care associated with credentialed healthcare, right? Those are two things that I think for a long period of time we, have kind of equated as being the same thing. If a clear background check exists, this person is a good person. There are very, very few scenarios in the world in which we live where we use the absence of information to make a determination about what will happen. In other words, a clear background check, a clear verification, a cleared reference check, right? Nothing bad happened. And they said, yeah, this person worked at this hospital, and yeah, they got their, master's at, this university, and they finished their, residency at this, hospital on this year. Yeah, everything checked out, and they have the licenses that they need to continue to perform care. Very rarely in other scenarios in our lives do we make the assumption that everything's going to be cool and everything's all good just because there's nothing there, right? Like I use my wife is a oil painter, and I talk about all the time. We say we never look at the background of a painting and are like, oh, well, that background is so great, and that's why the painting is awesome. No, it's we're looking at what's in the foreground. We're looking at the portrait that was painted. No one looks at the Mona Lisa and is like, man, that was like, you probably can't even name what's in the background of the Mona Lisa, right? It's the it's the woman slyly smiling at you. But too often I think in credentialing we begin to expect that everything is clear. There's a green light. We should trust. We should proceed just because the credential is in place. Behavioral risk involves patterns and a history of patterns that we've seen, a history of behavior that's occurred or has not occurred. So that's really where we see companies turn to online and social media screening, because you get a look at what happened when the camera isn't on. You get a look at when the interview was over, when the credentialing process started, when the exam was over, when the residency finished, and everything was wrapped up. What's happened since then, right? And what's happened in these, it's not like, again, like what sports team does someone like? Did you vote for, Kamala Harris or Donald Trump? That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the people that are normalizing hateful behavior or privacy violating behavior that they bring into the workplace, and the signals that you can identify related to that. So if nothing else from today's, presentation for listeners out there, like recognize that the absence of information or a clear credential doth not equate to good behavior.
Yeah. And I think at least the recruiters that I know, yeah, everything can look good on paper. It all adds up, and then we have had that happen. I've had that happen in my career. And then they show up for the site visit. So before the employment starts, but the site visit, and you go, oh, wait, everything looked good on paper, and they went to the right school and they've done the right things. So I think what you're saying is it does behoove us to go a step further. I think equally the investment that organizations are making right now in talent, from nurse, physician, executive, whatever, take the time, because to replace them costs, we know, exponentially more than, if you get it wrong, it is really, really wrong.
Anybody who's dealt with the issue and the fallout and the bad press or the regulator inquiry, the fine.
Sure.
We all know that's when everything stops. Fire drills start. Mm-hmm. And we take our attention away from the things that matter, that you should be focused on advancing your mission and investing in the health of, the community that you serve. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've lived those days when you get the urgent message, the state is in the building, and you know exactly who those folks are. The Joint Commission is in the building, and it is a full fire drill, red alert process when those things happen. Yeah. In another article, again, we'll share these articles that Fama has shared with us, how social media screening prevents healthcare misconduct. So in that article, you highlight how that online behavior can be an early detector of workplace risk. We've talked a lot about, these early detections to help you mitigate some of that risk in your hiring practice. What kind of patterns does AI detect that humans might overlook?
It's a great question. Well, part of the challenge of a real thorough online and social media analysis is that there's so much content out there, right? There's so much information between the likes, the comments, the posts, the shares, the sing-along videos, the sarcastic comments, the political commentary, the photos of your sheep doodle, which is in the back of your thing right now, right? Everything's out there, right? We got it all. So the challenge for people is like, how are you going to filter through all that? You're not going to have your team members go through every TikTok video that, that person has posted before their site visit, right? That's not a good use of anyone's time, right? Now they might be doing that, but they really shouldn't be, which you can talk about from a compliance perspective. But, overall, one of the things that we've just seen is that because AI in simple terms has the ability to filter through large amounts of unstructured information and make sense of it, right? And I think we've all seen that, especially in the medical field. Open evidence is a great example of that, but we see that outside of, that sort of technology, just in our day-to-day use of ChatGPT or these other LLMs, Gemini, that are out there. AI is really good at making sense of the signal within the noise. And that's really where we've seen it shine, is that being able to look at millions of posts and say, these are the 4 or 5 or 6 that, this person posted in the hospital of the patient when they were passed out. This is the one of them saying something racist on LinkedIn that you didn't catch on a comment box on, somebody's post, right? So that's really where this shines, the ability to kind of separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak.
Sure. Yeah. And I know that a lot of leaders worry. I've gone through this with several organizations I've worked for. As you look at how do you do this safely? So leaders worry about reviewing social media. Feels invasive.
Yep.
At least in my age group, which is older than your age group. A lot of times we'll say, we're glad there wasn't social media at certain stages of our life, right? So how do you balance privacy, fairness, and compliance while protecting, this patient-staff dynamic?
Yeah. The problem, with doing it yourself, as you described, and a lot of HR teams are told specifically, don't look at someone's social media, don't Google them, right? Because if you see stuff that you shouldn't see as a hiring manager, you can get exposed under the EEOC to a discrimination claim or an adverse impact claim. In other words, like if I was to go on Ben's social media and see that Ben is volunteering at a synagogue on the weekends, or he is in a wheelchair basketball league or something like that, right? I know that this person is Jewish. I know that they are disabled, right? And then the EEO, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, says, hey, even if you don't say that you're going to use it, even if you say, I'm not biased, I'm the most middle of the road person there is. You can say whatever you want about yourself, but the letter of the law says if you see that stuff, you can't unsee it. You can't unring the bell. That's a term we often hear. Can't put the toothpaste back in the tube, whatever term you want to use. Really, the way that employers are doing it today is using technology. You can essentially say, these are the things I want to know. These are only the things I want to know. In other words, like I want to know if somebody is posting photos of patients. I want to know if they're talking about the work that they're doing. I want to know if they are posting racist things or talking about illegal drugs in image, text, or video. Software like ours, essentially what it does, finds a person's web presence, filters through it, and only escalates a report for user review if it contains one of those risk-relevant behaviors that's core to managing that patient-staff, trust dynamic that you described. So doing it yourself, you are the filter. But trusting a technology partner that does it the same way every single time and flags intolerance the same way, flags sexual references the same way, these other elements that we've talked about here, who can, give you explainable AI, the accuracy, the precision, how the models were built, the training data that was used to create them, the tuning on the AI models. There are things that third parties can do. And we're seeing so much more of this now with the use of AI and all sorts of hiring contexts right now, where the things like the FCRA, the GDPR, the, plenty of different privacy, AI frameworks even at play here, making the AI explainable, giving a candidate, an employee, the opportunity to say, hey, explain themselves on a finding or something like that, obtaining consent for these types of checks. All of these things, just like normal background checks, are part of how to do these things, compliantly.
Yeah. What does responsible AI look like in this space, and how do you reduce that bias while you're identifying that risk?
Yeah, it's a key and recurring theme for us, something that I would say is like an ongoing pursuit for our company. And I like to think we've made a lot of progress, but it's not to say that we won't, continue to. But part of it comes down to like who's building the technology itself, right? Making sure that the engineering teams that you're hiring to build this sort of technology are reflective of the communities this product is designed to serve, right? So that goes into how you think about, DEI and B at your own company, at a company like ours, right? How do we think about who's building the technology? Is it a bunch of white dudes sitting around a table saying, hey, this is what intolerance looks like, right? That's not, the answer to the question. So, the sort of goal here starts with who's building it, but then there are a lot of techniques that essentially you can use to determine, like on random data sets that you randomly sample, auditing that you do of your algorithms on an ongoing basis. But there are a range of technical steps that you can take. And I know, as a fellow tech person, you know what I'm talking about. But for those that are out there who might not be as familiar, you can actually look at how AI labels the same piece of content 10 times in a row and see if it's consistent, right? How often it is inconsistent, then find in the inconsistencies, depending upon the type of AI that you're doing, exactly how those rules were created. So in simple terms, LLMs are a form of what they call unsupervised learning that essentially come up with a prediction about something based on the end state, and how they get to that end state is a black box, right? So they're like, hey, here's all the end states, predict how we get there. And that's an LLM, and that's unsupervised learning. In our world, we use something called supervised learning, where we actually can see the steps that an AI has taken to label a piece of content, and you kind of tune and model, the AI that you have to get to an acceptable level. We're around like 93% accurate in structuring and labeling content, but part of this being Canada's service provider. Here's what we can do. Here's what we can't do. Here's how accurate we are, just so you know. So transparency is a big part of it too.
Right. Sure, you've had a few of these, but can you walk us through a real world scenario where the proactive screening process that you've described prevented a serious issue for a healthcare organization employer?
Sure. I'll start with the most salacious, which was a doctor that we found who was literally selling body parts on Twitter and linking to like a dark web tour site, essentially, where he was selling like a Dr. Kevorkian, Devil in the White City, if anyone ever read that book, body parts out there. And crazy, right? And that person was fired, from the hospital that they were at. And there was a whole set of news stories about it. You can kind of see that if you check it out on Google. I think that's a public story now at this point. But, more generally, some of the things that really matter to our clients are identifying people that are stealing, from the hospital healthcare system. We've seen a whole bunch of, just people who act intolerantly towards others, and, catching that before those people come into the organization. But we're often the company that you never hear about because the risk that we prevented never occurs, right? It's why you don't really see advertisements for like seatbelts, because, seatbelts don't get a ton of positive, marketing, because most of the time they're just preventing you from getting hurt. And it's only when you see the seatbelt wasn't worn that, something goes down. So we're one of those companies that prevents the risk that never actually happens.
Yeah. I will say way back in the day, seatbelts did have ads. Just saying. I do remember that.
We're in like we're in like the phase of seatbelt ads right now.
Right. So in the 2024 research study titled State of Misconduct at Work, your research showed that the misconduct risk is rising. Are there some trends that stood out to you, and how should healthcare leaders and our listeners interpret them?
The biggest trend I think that we saw was really an increase in, intolerance and harassment in that report. I think that was kind of the thing to me that really, stuck out, which was, I think, a function and a reflection of some of the divisiveness we see, in society today. But a lot of the time, where we see a lot of the kind of impact and change is very relevant to specific organizations. But yeah, it was the intolerance piece, that really stuck out to me, was this sort of rise and increase of, people who, again, were, posting and treating others in ways that, they really shouldn't have, just based on what they look like.
Yeah. Are certain roles in healthcare more vulnerable to misconduct risk than others? And, maybe tell us why.
It sort of depends how you think about the role of misconduct risk in your organization and its broader impact. No one is protected from misconduct. People who are I'm trying to say this delicately. People who are truly problematic don't think that they're problematic, right? If you look at, there was this great interview. This is not the same thing, but this great interview in 2017, Charlottesville, riots and protests and the white nationalists and all that, where a Black female reporter interviewed two members of the KKK. It was the first time like a Black female reporter, had gone into like a KKK meeting and interviewed this husband and wife with their masks off, right? She asked them, like, how did you get to a point where, you found racism as such a central part of your life. And, most people would equate being racist with the KKK, right? Obviously. And these two people said, oh, we're not racist. This is just how we grew up, right? And so if two people in the KKK don't think they're racist, imagine, where people who think that they aren't exhibiting misconduct, right? It's that kind of normalization of aberrant behavior that we're really tracking for and clocking for as part of our product. So it isn't as if there are people that are immune to workplace misconduct by any stretch, but the people that have the greatest potential impact on that type of misconduct, we used to think it was just executives, right? It used to just be, well, if it's an executive that does something bad, it's going to be bad for our brand. If it is the lead surgeon that does something bad, or the head of the department who does something bad or says something bad, then that's really going to be a problem for the hospital healthcare system. But what we've seen now, because of social media, the example I shared at the top of the, nurse who was taking pictures of someone who was passed out, right? That's a nurse, right? We've seen examples of, people who work in literally janitorial functions who are posting about stealing things from hospitals that have caused huge stirs in the media, right? And so while we like to think that it's just executives that are most exposed, I would say generally no one is safe from misconduct. But it used to be when we started the company that it was just executives that were kind of the ones who were being screened. But now, because of the role of social media and its tentacles and how it can kind of spider out, we find ourselves in a position that, really is quite different. So it really is everybody. And the short answer to your question is like, really, there isn't a specific set of roles. It's the healthcare systems that use us screen everybody who gets a badge.
Yeah. It's best practice, right? If you're doing this type of process, it should be, this is definitely an all or none type of a thing when you're doing this work. Yeah. We talked about the 6 generations in the workforce just briefly, and I think that is it's a fascinating concept to think about. And, myself in a generation and you, and, it's really interesting to me. But what generational or cultural shifts are influencing some of this workplace behavior today? And, how do the recruiters, like my recruitment audience and healthcare recruitment, how should we adapt? There's a ton of work being done on generational relationships and things like that. But anything that you have for us on how we could adapt?
Yeah, I think it's being like water, being malleable, right? It's meeting people where they're at and not trying to force change on people on their own evolution. So I think it's really important when we answer this question to kind of examine it from the lens of what is the current state? How can we kind of evaluate where things are and not try to change things, but meet people where they're at and engage with them on their terms? And, look no further than, the people around you, wherever you are listening right now. If there are people around you, I could bet almost half of them have their face down in a phone, right? You look at Gen Z and Millennial, they've got 5 or 6 hours per day that they're spent on the phone, right? So let's just talk about in simple terms what that is. Maybe let's just be generous. You sleep for 10 hours, right? You've got 5 hours on the phone, right? You are in work for 6-7 hours per day. Some of that time is going to be on the phone too, but let's just hope people are on the phone at work. Of your waking hours, the vast majority, if you take your meals out, that's an hour and a half, 2 hours, right? You can do the back of the napkin math here. People are living their lives online, and whether we like it or not. And that trend is not going anywhere. So that's one piece, right? Which is like the digital versions of ourselves. We need to welcome that is happening. The people that are coming right now over this professional Rubicon into the workplace, they are, I don't even know the numbers for Generation Alpha of how much time they're spending on their phone. But this is the first year, you talk about 6 generations. This is the first year, believe it or not, people who are 16 years old, I think 2010 is when Generation Alpha starts. So people who are 16, right, are now finding themselves in the workplace as interns or flipping burgers, whatever it might be, right? And so, we have 6 generations in the workplace where you have to recognize that whether you tell your kids or you're upset about it or not, this train is moving. This is happening. People are going to be spending time on phones, and it's going to keep happening. The AI wave that's coming is going to make this even more pronounced from my personal perspective. Now, I think there's going to be a bit of a reversion to the mean where things like, comedy and performances are going to be even more important now in this digital world that we're in. But the first piece you have to recognize is you got a bunch of digital natives who are very comfortable online. And rather than being like, get off your phone, okay, let's talk about you're on your phone, let's make the most of it, right? Let's figure out how we can take this forward together. The second piece I would point out, and is the idea of the hybridized work environment. We see a lot now where, especially post-COVID, the care providers that we talk to have spoken a lot about how patient communication and where work starts and ends has completely evaporated now, where we start to see, because it's so much easier now for patients to engage with care providers, whether it's on the phone or via the various apps that are out there, that line between when you are talking and engaging with your colleagues is also no longer just in the hospital. It's no longer in the office, right? And so now we're in a position where if Christy and I are working the same shift in the same floor, on the same floor, and we've, our shifts are over, but, this patient is emailing Christy, who's the doctor, and I'm the nurse, and Christy messages me, and she's like, hey, Ben, like, remind me of this thing, of this, that, and the other thing on this readout. And we're talking on our, our healthcare, chat app, whatever the secure communication form that we're using. Like, we are engaging with ourselves, together in a digital way, right? Is it crazy that Christy would be like, oh, you know what? I've never looked Ben up on Facebook, or I've never looked at his LinkedIn profile. Like, he's responding to me at 10:45, PM. I wonder what he's doing. Like, and she looks me up on Facebook and sees this crazy stuff I've been posting, right? So the lines between work and personal life have been fundamentally blurred. So my advice is general. It's one, recognize that the way that work happens has changed. And just if you are going to be engaging digitally with your colleagues, expect that they will blend the personal and the professional in that moment. Two is this concept and idea that you are not going to be able to fight the wave of the digital generation that's coming and the use of phones and technology. So hop on board and find the ways to make the most out of it, because your workforce is digital now, and your screening technology should evolve to reflect that transformation.
Yeah. I've tried to, throughout my career, really just to I have one life, and then the things I do, like I do things with my family and my friends, and my work is one of those things. So I've lived in that blended environment, I think probably because I have worked remotely or hybrid for about 15 years. So I think that it is a leap for people to have those things kind of flow into each other, like you said. So, as I talk to my recruitment audience here, how should this misconduct prevention be incorporated into their hiring workflow so it's not slowing down time to fill? Does it go in with medical staff, CVO, or somewhere else in the process?
Yeah, I think that's exactly where it goes, actually. And part of this is like, we can, we deliver these checks within one business day at maximum, right? And you can even get it same business day if that's a high priority for you. So I think that CVO process is exactly where, this is supposed to go. We do see some companies that run it maybe at like the conditional offer stage as well, so we do see sort of a mix there. But I would say at that moment where you're making the decision, is this a person we want to advance forward in the process, when you're down to, a single or a handful of people, that's kind of where we think about it.
Yeah. So how can TA leaders really position this proactive screening, not as a gotcha tactic? I think you actually said that earlier, but part of building a safer, more inclusive culture.
I think part of it is developing the broader narrative and story of where this fits in, right? Which is sort of what I began with at the top of the podcast, which is like saying to, the staff around you, because there is going to be work here. Anytime we do something new, anytime there's change management, healthcare is by far our biggest vertical. I'm sure there are plenty of healthcare hospital systems that, you may know they're doing some form of social media screening today, but my recommendation is always to not make it overcomplicated, because you're right. Like, people can view this as like, well, you're going to look at what I'm, who I voted for, like what my favorite sports team is, like, how is it relevant to you, what I do on social media? But the reality is that employers in the healthcare space have been evaluating behavior for a long period of time as part of overall fitness for a role or a position. The reality is now is that those behaviors appear online for this generation. So that's my recommendation. When you want to, position this as proactive screening of, I wouldn't flip it as like, this is a new process for us, but our old processes need to evolve to reflect the demographic changes that we're seeing with 6 generations in the workplace, where most of those people are plugged and glued to their phone. So that's really the mindset for us, is like, keep it simple. It doesn't need to be more complicated than that. But the bottom line, these behaviors appear online now. We can find them. We can do it compliantly. We can aid in creating, the culture that we want that drives the business forward and advances, our mission to deliver high quality care to the community.
Right. So if you were advising a leader today, what 3 actions would you recommend that would immediately reduce their misconduct risk in 2026?
Sure. I think the 3 actions I would recommend to a CEO are sort of threefold. One, examine your existing process. Take a look at your stack. Are there any types of, and if you're a CEO, you can guide your CHRO, your head of risk. You've got a range of different roles that can support you here. Folks in, the ethics side of the house, we see a range of different HR governance. We see legal teams getting involved, but let's look at our stack of where we're making assumptions. Where are we making assumptions on quality, right? And are those assumptions aligned to the technology or tools that we're using, right? In other words, do we have any false assumptions on just because somebody is credentialed or they have a clear background check that they're a clear green light, right? Based on the risk as it presents itself today. So that's the first piece, is like a basic audit with not the idea of what is our tech stack in terms of evaluating misconduct and evaluating risk within our organization, specifically as it relates to people, but are there any false assumptions we're making about the role that a background check is providing, or a licensure check is providing, or license monitoring is providing, right? Are there any steps that we're making with risk as it presents itself today that we're making any false assumptions? The second, very easy to run an audit on something like this too. You don't have to go deep on naming names or who's who, or where the risks come up, where the flags come up. This is sort of assessing the need, I would say, at the end of the day. And the general idea here is like, you could do that through talking to your peers. Are they doing this type of check? Why? What is the value that they are seeing? How is it managing both patient staff trust, but at the same time, minimizing privacy and HIPAA violations? And the third and final thing I would say is put in a phone call to Fama, healthcare CEO. That would be my third and final, because I'll talk to you. We are very proud to work with healthcare organizations. We build our technology around healthcare, financial services as well. It's our 2 biggest verticals. We work in high stakes, highly regulated industry where getting it wrong has a high cost.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. I think that's a key point there, that highly regulated industry, everyone should be acting with a heightened awareness, I think.
I agree.
Well, on behalf of PracticeLink, I want to thank Ben for sharing his expertise and perspective with us today. Ben, really appreciate the important work that you and the Fama team are doing to help organizations build safer, more accountable workplaces.
Thank you so much. Such a fun conversation. Let's do it again. Thanks again for having me.
For our listeners, if you'd like to learn more about how proactive screening and AI-driven insights can support safer hiring practices within your organization, I encourage you to explore Fama's research and resources. And as always, we welcome your thoughts and questions or feedback on today's episode. You can visit PracticeLink.com or contact us directly at plmedia@PracticeLink.com. Remember to subscribe, like, follow, and share this podcast with others. I'm Christy Bray, and this has been Workforce Wisdom. Thank you for listening. I look forward to bringing more conversations that inspire, inform, and transform the future of healthcare recruitment.